Because it's gone quiet, I think that was a good signal, I think, to kick off. Good evening, everybody. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this year's Fitzwilliam College Foundation Lecture delivered by Sir Adrian Smith, Whither, Rational Thinking in a Digital Age. As the current president of the Royal Society, Sir Adrian stands at the helm of the world's oldest scientific academy in continuous existence, an institution that's been at the forefront of scientific inquiry since 1660. Sir Adrian's own contributions to the field of statistics and mathematics are hugely impressive, with a career spanning his role as Vice-Chancellor of the University of London, Director General of Knowledge and Innovation in the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills, and Director and Chief Executive of the Alan Turing Institute, and much more besides. The topic of tonight's lecture could not be more timely. In an era where information flows at unprecedented speeds and volumes, where artificial intelligence is reshaping the landscape of knowledge production and dissemination, and where social media algorithms often prioritize engagement over accuracy, the question of rational thinking's place and future is urgent and complex. As a Cambridge college, we are, of course, committed to fostering intellectual growth and critical inquiry. But how do we help equip our students and scholars with the tools to navigate the complexities of the digital landscape? The Q&A session following the lecture, which will be shared by our colleague, Professor Keshav, Robert Sansom, Professor of Computer Science and Fitz Fellow, will provide an opportunity for an exchange of ideas. Adrian, thank you very much for coming and welcome.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. It can but be downhill all the way. The rather pretentious title of this lecture was Dictated, and I wasn't clear whether the person writing it down at the other end would realize there were two H's in Whither. So the title is a question as opposed to a statement that we're all doomed. I will confess at the beginning that as someone, just give a little bit about myself, grew up in an analog rather than a digital age. I am increasingly kind of grumpy old man in need of therapy. So I hope the discussion session will serve for that. Why did I end up a rather narrowly focused numerical rationalist? It's all the fault of the First World War, where my grandfather was in the Navy and was shot down, I think, at the Battle of Jutland, and spent a long time in the water and had lifelong pleurisy and other problems, and was often bedbound. And as a 3 or 4 year old, I was sent to keep him company. So being a Devonian sailor, he was not well versed in literature, music, and the rest of the arts, but he did know how to count, and on board he played chess. So I spent my years 3 to 4 counting and playing board games with my grandfather. So you could say that I had a numerical rational grooming from an early age. Now, the dreadful result of that was I could do fractions, percentages, and decimals before I went to infant school, and was therefore regarded as a freak. They attached a maths label at an early age, completely wrongly, of course. It should have been an arithmetic label. And then I went to a small Devon co-ed grammar school, and having been groomed, I continued really to be attracted to have love affairs with rule-based rational systems. And of course, the grammar schools in those days gave you precisely that: Euclidean geometry and Latin, the foundations of how to think properly. Hands up all those who missed out on Euclidean geometry and Latin. Good, I feel superior already. And then somehow that led to the inevitability of going to Cambridge to do mathematics. So I spent 3 years here between 1965 and 1968, remote from everything that's happened in the following 60 years. So overwhelmingly, it was an analog world. No internet, no mobile phones, no ATMs, and banks closed at lunchtime on a Friday. So if you didn't have the wit to get there before lunchtime on a Friday with your checkbook, you had a really miserable weekend. And not only did you have to get your fiver out before lunchtime on a Friday, you had to stock up with old 1 shilling coins, or you had no heating or hot water in your college room. A digression, I was once telling all this to an audience of current undergrads and was about to say how utterly, totally different it was, not like today's world. Then I remembered back in the 60s, it was the time of the Vietnam War, the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia, Six-Day War in the Middle East, and this against the background, recent background of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the US-Soviet Union MAD doctrine, mutually assured destruction. MAD, but actually maybe rational. We might discuss that later. Because we're back there again, aren't we? So nuclear Armageddon, I said the last time I mentioned this, at least we don't have the threat of that. I've now corrected the speech in the light of announcements that were made today. But back in the, presumably all of you have seen the film Oppenheimer and nuclear atomic weapon development. I had a little frisson of my own when I was at Selwyn College because I discovered my tutor at Selwyn had been best friends with Klaus Fuchs, who ran off with all the Los Alamos secrets. But throughout school and university, without necessarily naming or appreciating it, I had been educated and imbibed what we might now call the values and thought processes of the so-called Enlightenment. The commitment and emphasis of reason over tradition, and the challenge to the so-called authority of ancient writings, combined with notions of freedom of thought, tolerance, evidence-based beliefs, and actions. During Cambridge and subsequently as a postgraduate, I focused on the mathematics of probability and statistics, the mathematics of how to make sense of the all-pervasive, ubiquitous uncertainty that enters every nook and cranny of our personal lives, societal and economic decision-making, and scientific modeling, and understanding of the physical and biological worlds we inhabit. So for me, a very central concept is that of uncertainty and doubt as the fundamentals for how to approach the world. For 30 years as a jobbing academic, I wrestled with how to approach rational reasoning about uncertainty in the light of available and changing information. And over that time, and with increasing acceleration, we had the challenge of how vastly increased computer power and the rise of artificial technology both actually empowers, but also potentially disrupts and replaces our previous methodologies. So here we have technological challenge to our previous potential technological challenge to our previous rational paradigms. And what we might do in the discussion is toss around that form of challenge. Now, I, as grumpy old man, have an uneasy sense that these kinds of underlying Enlightenment values may now be under challenge, at least in some places and contexts. Increasing intolerance, no platforming in universities, hounding of individual academics makes me feel profoundly uneasy. Sally was kind enough, I think, to mention 4 years I spent in government, originally as Director General of Science and Research, which later morphed into the wonderful title of Director General Knowledge and Innovation, where you had to be very careful with the comma, because I didn't want to be the Director of General Knowledge. In that context, I was the senior civil servant in charge of research policy and funding. First 2 years under the last 2 years of Gordon Brown's government, the next 2 years under the Conservative Lib Dem coalition. The point of being there, bridging between research community and decision-making ministers, was to wave the flag, as always, for evidence-based policy. And one might think that that's obvious, that all policy evidence-based, but I encountered at least one minister who genuinely claimed that he had been elected to do values-based policy, not evidence-based policy. We might look at that sort of conflict later. Last year, I finished a 5-year term, as Sally said, as director of the Alan Turing Institute, a slightly schizophrenic dual world of astonishing and transformative technical advances, but all the time accompanied by considerable societal and ethical challenges. And I think that sort of conflict is at the heart of what we might discuss later. And I'm now entering my last year of 5 years as president of the Royal Society, with a primary role of carrying the torch for reason and evidence, supporting the Society's long-standing, 360 plus years, dual mission of nurturing both science itself and its application for the benefit of humanity. So a topical digression, I and many of my other fellows of the Royal Society observe with interest the nomination in the US of a science skeptic to the role of Secretary of Health and Human Services. I think this is a historical first, which we will watch with tremendous interest. So returning to the digital revolution, just reminding you of some significant dates. The internet grew out of a thing called the ARPANET around about 1969. And when I was a postgraduate student at UCL, on the way to the gents' toilets, there were these kind of mad computer scientists with wires coming out of their ears who were chuntering away to California, and we all thought they were completely mad. The comms protocols date from about 1983, and the World Wide Web developed between, let's say, 1991 and 93. So for roughly half of my career, the things that are every day weren't there. The mobile phone versions thereof first appeared around 1975, but the first UK rollout, I think, was around 1985, 40 years ago. And the advent of social media, unless you count the Morse code, which was 1844, I think that was the first social media, was around 1997 in the form of a platform called 6 Degrees. Computer scientists keep their hands over. Anybody else ever heard of 6 Degrees? It was the forerunner of Facebook. It was a form of Facebook which didn't succeed, and Facebook followed on. I'll come back to some thoughts about AI a bit later, but perhaps interesting to remind this audience that in 1973, James Lyell, a very wonderful mathematician, was commissioned to write a report on AI. And he basically said, this is a load of nonsense and hype, and the UK shouldn't get involved in it. So there was a little bit of a winter, not even of discontent, following that. So some generalities which are rather trite, but I mean, they do underlie what we should be talking about. The digital revolution has, of course, led to both great potential benefits for humanity, but also to a range of challenges. Challenges both individual, societal, geopolitical, and, come back to this later, what we're seeing now, the Royal Society hat on, is the potential transformation of the very nature and conduct of doing science itself, which is quite a profound shift. So I'll embark from now on a sort of Cook's tour of some of these opportunities and challenges, not pontificating, but posing questions which you're supposed to answer in the discussion. So first, a disclaimer. This is not a proper academic talk with footnotes and references. Whatever I think has been acquired magpie-like over the years from many sources and I've totally forgotten what the sources were. So if anyone recognizes something that I've pinched, be flattered rather than annoyed. But first, we should ask, are we overacting to all this? Isn't this just another tech revolution? We've been there before. Think of the invention of the printing press. It began a process of democratizing knowledge, expanding the potential beyond previous elites. A direction of travel in which information moved from being a privilege to being more like a right. That's what a tech revolution does. So what's special now? The curation and dissemination of data through the internet, social media platforms, and now large language models gives us, individually and socially, unparalleled potential to reshape our perspectives and understandings in real time. The original Enlightenment had at its core an emphasis on reason over tradition and prompted societies to re-establish, to reevaluate established norms. Digital technologies, likewise, are disrupting established norms. But a key question, at least for me, that we might discuss later is, what if one of the post-Enlightenment norms that's being challenged is that of the supremacy of evidence and reason itself? Pause for effect. An example on the positive side, one consequence of the original Enlightenment was the redefinition, for example, of the practice of medicine from chicanery and witch doctors to a more evidence-based approach. If you now fast forward to an imminent data and AI-driven shift in today's healthcare, not just diagnosing, but predicting health states, genetically based personal medicine is an emerging reality. So there are great positives that we might talk about a bit later. But on the less positive side, the digital is transforming in ways that we, maybe you, I for sure, do not fully understand. Transforming the rules that govern personal relationships, business communications, and the nature and availability of work. So as well as the now ubiquitous cascade of mis- and disinformation, deepfakes, and human copywriting concerns, I think the digital surround is creating for many individuals levels of distraction and dependence that make me concerned about the survival for many of what I regard as rational thinking. But we might discuss that later. Another difference, maybe, from the original Enlightenment revolution was that although it undermined previous authority in some sense, the new moral values were driven forward by a replacement elite, the overthrow of one authoritative elite, but those who founded the royal society. We democratized in some sense, but they were still a priestly elite. And so it was the new elite following the Enlightenment who set the groundwork for social structures and ethical surround. So is there any analogy, and what would it be in the case of the digital revolution? Which of the elites? Are we being molded by a tech mogul elite? Or, for better or for worse, is there now total democratization of the moral playground? Both could be true, of course. So the digital revolution is radically changing lifestyles, our economies, our social practice. It's also transforming how we relate to information. We're confronted with an unprecedented mass of available information and a profusion of competing points of view. You might say, hooray, the democratization, et cetera, which are expressed unfiltered by a process that's hard for internet and social media users to understand. So where in the middle of all that is rational thinking, and who owns it, and how do we hold on to it? So the saturation and deregulation of the online information market is putting a severe strain on our ability to process and discriminate, making us, of course, more vulnerable to false information that circulates online. So this not only has the potential to influence our individual attitudes and day-to-day behaviors, but also, perhaps more sinisterly, our worldview, the emergence of numerous parallel realities, and the loss of a commonly agreed space required for exchange of opinion, ideas, and values, with the same rules of what we regard as rational interchange. The big problem we face, if we're really worried about that, is that any attempt that I've heard or read about to counter disinformation runs the risk of undermining the basic values of free expression and democracy itself. Freedom of expression, opinion, and information, we presumably sign up to, but if we increasingly don't like what people say and how they say it, and how it affects lives around us, we obviously want to think hard about it. So I think it follows that it's hard to contemplate attempts to completely eradicate, whatever that would mean, misinformation, disinformation, fake news, conspiracy theories. So instead, what might we aspire to do? We might attempt to limit the propagation of material that undermines democratic processes and values. We might, as we try, to block hate material directed at individuals and identify and punish illegal behavior and increase user awareness and vigilance. But beyond that, other things we ought to be contemplating for discussion. We could invest more in understanding the psychosocial mechanisms that make us vulnerable to false information and identify maybe levers that can be used to limit its effect. So although false information only constitutes a small minority of the information content circulating on the internet and social media, enough of it seems to me to make an impression and is therefore potentially harmful to both the individuals concerned and society. So how to mitigate? One possible recommendation is to go back to the individual person, the individual mind, the individual potential non-rational thinker, and to place more emphasis, considerably more emphasis, in the education system on the teaching of, I can't find better words, the teaching of critical thinking capability, to develop the key faculty of distinguishing the true from the false, especially on the internet and social media. Is this something we should gather around, raise a banner, and try and influence and change in input into the education system, both in schools and, I would say, in universities? Many of the algorithms behind the functioning of the internet and social media platforms, while not, of course, they can't be directly responsible for our beliefs and behavior, do influence them. And of course, there are ways we all understand in which algorithms organize and rank and organize the rank and frequency of appearance of information based on its attention-drawing capacity. In particular, on how social media alters the perception of the representativeness and popularity of certain points of view, and has asymmetric influence, enabling the prevalence of certain extreme minority views. Is there a way of combating this? A techie way, perhaps, to look at measures to improve the design of user interfaces and counter popularity bias, moving away from algorithms designed on a purely commercial basis. One of the main drivers of disinformation is actually, I think, profit rather than ideology. Studies of the fake news economy show that advertising provides a substantial source of income for disinformation makers, often without the knowledge of the companies whose advertisements are found on websites propagating hateful content or conspiracy theories. So can we somehow encourage good practice by platforms to prevent indirect participation in the funding of projects involving incitement to hatred or propagation of disinformation? There are, of course, other drivers of disinformation, seems particularly apposite these days. In particular, the worsening of the global geopolitical climate has given rise to an ongoing confrontational dynamic played out in the digital sphere and associated with cyber interference operations. We've seen this in recent election campaigns. I am pessimistic that international law will do anything in this area, but it is of increasing concern to governments. And you remember the UK ran the AI Safety Summit last year looking at this. More later, perhaps. Ultimately, perhaps, the best response to information disorders is to go back to the idea of individual moderation. Because we are all now, every time you click in, you are now an operator in the online information market. So this takes us back to the idea of what we might call media and information literacy and the teaching of critical thinking and training in intellectual vigilance to support independence of judgment. Again, I think these things are up for grabs. And even more challenges will now start to arise in the so-called metaverse as that concept leads us, virtual reality, et cetera, in the direction of a universe in which we're not only getting mis and disinformation, but we're immersed in an increasing conflation of real and virtual worlds. So yet another challenge. Let me speak a bit about AI. What is it all about? Well, making machines intelligent? But what does that mean? To answer this question, and I think Stuart Russell did this kind of thing in his Reith lectures, to answer the question, AI starts by asking what in the 1950s was a widely accepted and constructive definition of human intelligence. And it goes as follows, and you probably all have seen it. Humans are intelligent to the extent that our actions can be expected to achieve our objectives. Pause, I'll say it again, just in case. Humans are intelligent to the extent that our actions can be expected to achieve our objectives. All other characteristics of intelligence, perceiving, thinking, learning, inventing, can be understood through their contributions to our ability to act successfully. So if you were looking at machines then, maybe you start off in the same way. And a machine is intelligent to the extent that its actions can be expected to achieve its objectives. However, there's a bit of a problem because maybe at the current time, machines, unlike humans, don't have objectives. We give them the objectives. And you probably know, so we build achieving machines, we feed objectives, we specialize them for particular objectives, and off they go. And again, I think Stuart used this particular one. The robot babysitter may be a familiar paradigm to you all. Its objective is to make sure it feeds the baby. So it goes to the fridge and it's empty. It goes to the cupboard and it's empty. It opens all the drawers and they're empty. It looks around the room and sees the pet rabbit. Just thinking of intelligence as computation itself led to a revolution in psychology and a new kind of theory, programs instead of simple mathematical laws. It also led to a slightly new definition of rationality that reflects the finite computational powers of any real entity, whether artificial or human. So again, if you look historically, back in the 60s and 70s, systems for logical reasoning and planning were developed and were embodied to create autonomous mobile robots, for example. Logic programming and rule-based expert systems supported some of the first commercial applications of AI in the early 80s, creating great interest in the US and Japan. Took us longer to get around because James Lightill has told us it was all a load of nonsense back in the 70s. So Britain had to play catch up, having stopped nearly all AI research. Then in the 1990s, AI developed new methods for representing and reasoning about probabilities and causality in complex systems, and these methods have spread to nearly every area of science. Over the past decade, as we all know, so-called deep learning systems appear to recognize human speech very well, recognize objects in images, translate between hundreds of different human languages. Increasingly, AI is important in the economy, running everything from search engines to autonomous delivery planes for Amazon. The goal of AI for some has always been what's referred to as general purpose AI or general AI, whatever. That is, machines that can learn to perform well across the whole range of tasks that humans can perform, as opposed to recognizing images or searching the web. If it were so, general purpose AI systems would far exceed human capabilities. They can crunch faster, think faster. And this would be, I think, an inflection point for civilization. However, I feel very safe in saying this, and I feel safer with every year that passes. I do not expect to see this in my lifetime, or ever. Let me catch up here. Yeah. If there were to be such, I think, again, it's an example perhaps from Stuart Russell, if there were to be the incredibly all-seeing, all general purpose AI program, it would both be able to design gravitational wave detectors for outer space and run Eurovision. It just seems tricky to develop a machine that could do that. In terms of the dangers, I won't go on forever. The obvious things that come to one that are worrying at the moment, it's all very well to develop a wonderful program that can beat the world's Go champion. Fantastic. How does it do it? Nobody knows. That's all very well, I think, for beating Go champions. It's probably not all right for developing surgical robots. So transparency and explicability, explainability are fantastically important. The issue of whether automation will spur great job loss. The ability to create deepfakes, privacy violation, algorithms developed on bad data, and this is almost a topic for another talk, that you have to train these things on data. Where does the data come from? It's collected by fallible human beings. It has biases, etc. Bias in, bias out. There may be, at the heart of all this, development of further socioeconomic inequality, and so on, and so on. So there are real problems here. I'm going to end on a positive note and then return to the gloom. AI is going to change, in many areas, the very nature of scientific inquiry. If you go back to the beginnings of the Royal Society, or just common sense, how do we try and learn and understand about the world? Well, we've got vision, so we see things. Trees, birds, butterflies, water flowing, and we acquire data through the human eye. And then we get fed up with that because the human eye has limitations, so to go small, we develop a microscope. Then we develop a more powerful microscope. Then we develop an electron microscope. And then we build synchrotrons. And each time we do that, the seeing is more remote from the human, and we see it through enormous amounts of data that then have to be stored, curated, and mucked about with. In the opposite direction, we have a telescope, then we have a big telescope, then we have a bloody great telescope up a mountain, and then we have a radio telescope, and then we shove the telescope out into space, and then we do gravitational wave detectors. Each time we take these steps, we get a phenomenal change in the scale and complexity of data. And the ability of humans, in some sense, to play with that data and model it in an old-fashioned sense begins to fade away. So some people have seen 4 kind of stages of the development of science. The first stage, simple, as it were, experimentation and observation. Second stage, where you try and apply the rational human mind to make models, mathematical models, to understand the phenomenon. Those mathematical models then get really complex and you can't solve them. So the computer does it for you by simulating what would be the outcomes of the equations if you could solve them. So simple experiment, theory, computer simulation, and now what some people would see as the 4th paradigm. It is that data and patterns in that data can be explored and understanding suggested by the algorithms themselves, remote from the intervention of the human, in certain sense. Of course, the human has to build the AI model. But vast data and AI is impacting the very process of science. And I think that is incredibly interesting, valuable, important. It will transform healthcare. It will transform robotics. It will transform all areas of science and understanding. And that can only be a good thing. But the negative, the gloom, societal, accompanied by this, now the divergence, the incredible power to understand the world in a better way, coupled with increasing societal irrationality, the dethroning of the nature of evidence and truth, and the reshaping of young brains by the exposure to the digital. I will end there, and you can tell me what the solutions are. Okay?
Thank you very much. I think you probably. Thank you very much. I think that was incredibly. That was an incredibly thought-provoking speech. And as the person who's supposed to be helping ask you questions, you already left the audience with quite a few questions for them to ask you. So does anybody have a question? Or I have asked one question that I may, perhaps, while people are collecting their thoughts. Okay. So you talk about the transformation of rules by AI, by science broadly. And I was wondering whether you think of this transformation as being emergent, as an emergent property, as intentional by somebody intentionally trying to transform the rules, or opportunistically seeing the ability to transform rules, or some combination of all of them.
Which rules are we referring to?
The rules by which people, you started your talk with rules of society, rules by which we judge and make policies.
Since I disapprove of conspiracy theory, I don't really have one. I think it's all a wonderful accident. The interaction, there's a feedback loop, isn't there? You have the ability to use technology in a particular way. That itself, you're choosing to change your behavior. If you're on a social media site or you're clicking buttons for an advertiser or whatever, that changed behavior on your part feeds into the way the algorithm then kind of responds. So there's a feedback interactive loop between the humans and any of the technologies. But do I believe that some tech mogul or wicked person is designing stuff deliberately to make us bad and stupid? Half. So certainly the profit-driven reinforcement algorithms. I think, well, if only we could make everybody aware and not buy it.
Mm-hmm. So in that sense, perhaps opportunistic is more combined with the emergence of this feedback.
Accidental, maybe.
Accidental, right. Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the... Yes, in the back over there. Yes, thank you. Sorry, Nicola's going to bring you the...
Microphone will turn itself on. You don't need to push any buttons.
I was interested by what you said about critical thinking. In the 1970s, some of the new universities wanted new courses, and they put critical thinking into their first years as a compulsory course. And it was generally given to the philosophers to teach it because it was thought they were the best people to teach it. But broadly, that experiment doesn't seem to have worked. Most of the universities that tried compulsory critical thinking for first-year undergraduates have abandoned it now. I think it'd be very interesting. I mean, maybe it's just the fault of the philosophers. We were very bad at teaching it. But, I mean, I personally think it's a very good idea. So I think it would be interesting to try to work out what went wrong with that experiment in teaching critical thinking.
So two thoughts. One very rude, far too important to be left to the philosophy department.
I thought you'd say that, yeah.
The second thought is I'm more concerned, I think, in getting it into schools from the very beginning. Of course, you don't sit a 5-year-old down and say, I'm now going to teach you critical thinking. But that we ought to be able to find creative ways whereby we expose young kids to stuff that gives them that kind of awareness. But I wouldn't be an expert in designing that. But I do think the education, I'd start in the school education system, very early age. To make it easier, of course, you could take people's phones and stuff away from them.
Which some people are doing. Thank you. Any other? Yes, over there, please.
If I look like a rabbit in the headlines, it's because we are down here.
So, yeah, thank you. Thank you for a nice talk. So one word that hasn't been mentioned yet is imagination. Whether you include that in rational thinking, because as humans doing science, many of the innovations, the theory, Einstein's general relativity came about from a leap in imagination. One could say an irrational thought experiment. So yeah, is imagination rational thinking, and will computers help us with that?
I suspect it's a different category. One of the things you try and do in a mathematical proof or a scientific model is you're trying to get an understanding that removes ambiguity. I remember when I was at school, I read a book by, can't remember who it was by, Empson, William Empson, 7 Types of Ambiguity. I mean, the whole point of poetry is ambiguity, isn't it? I mean, or that kind of wordplay. That's fantastic, but I think it's a different box. Yeah, Dr. Johnson said opera an exotic and irrational thing. I like going to exotic, irrational evenings out, but I don't want doctors and designers of transport and those trying to control the climate to think they can find the answers in poetry or opera. I think it's a different box. And but the idea that imagination isn't there in scientific thinking and mathematics. There's huge amounts of imaginative creativity. But the difference is, we poor guys have got rules surrounding it. We can't just make up anything we want.
Feynman used to say imagination in science is like imagination in a straitjacket.
That's mathematics. Good definition of mathematics.
Over there.
Thank you very much. I was very interested in your point about the morality, moral thinking relative to the Enlightenment times. It's absolutely fair to say that practically all the establishments of the society in Europe actually have lost some credibility. the church goers are now reducing, and actually has already reduced. And the scientists are not actually faring that well themselves. And governments also have lost quite a lot in the recent debates and elections. So in your view, which ones of these are the priorities to rebuild, to provide people who are developing these digital means of innovation some moral support? I absolutely appreciate your point, but I would like to see whether there is a particular way out that you can show us. Thank you.
No, I think whatever I tried to say on that would be very disappointing. I think part of the point I was making that, so I have done some of this talk elsewhere where I got beaten up for not understanding the Enlightenment. That really, it wasn't beauty, truth, and goodness at all. It was just one elite taking over from another elite. And I've got some sympathy with that view, actually. I mean, the Royal Society is a priestly class. We want deference. We want people to believe us. We want to be authoritative. But we don't want another young generation to come along and overthrow that authority. Paradox. But I think there was a democratization, a sense of kind of liberty and, in the air, whatever that kind of meant. In terms of, if you're locked into social media, are you in some sense losing certain forms of liberty? If you have to look at your phone 20 times a day, are you losing certain kinds of choices? And if you're going to have mental health problems as a child, if you're not part of some Facebook group of supporters who like you, that's not a very adequate answer to your question. But yeah. Well, maybe a values vacuum. You have to assert some values. If you assert the value of individual liberty, and then people use it by being on their phone 24 hours a day, well, you tried.
Could I just expand on that question a little bit more, just to pick up on this social network? In some sense, what the question is asking was about institutional credibility and the lack of institutional credibility. Do you think that's being replaced with social credibility? You care about your network of friends or your followers, your influencers. If you become an influencer, is that replacement of institutional credibility with social credibility one of the root causes?
Well, yeah, so just take one example. If you took religious authority, I mean, the church, the preacher, whatever, preachers are now podcasters, aren't they?
Yeah.
It's just a new form of doing it and a slightly different emphasis.
Indeed. And so since there is no institution behind them and they don't have to play by the institutional rules, that gives us the freedom to be...
But that was, the Reformation actually broke that because the rules of the Catholic Church, that was a rule-based. But the umpteen forms of Protestantism was throwing the balls up in the air.
Yes.
And talk about democratization of the printing press. Actually, most of the stuff that came out after printing were Looney Tunes religious tracts.
That's very true. Thank you. In the front over here.
So you mentioned a number of things that will be transformed by AI, including medicine, science in general, etc. And you used the word democratization frequently, but you didn't talk about it threatening democracy itself that I heard. And so obviously one of the major profit drivers or the sources of profit would be to control democracy. You quite rightly, I think, say that AI is not going to be a bogeyman, it's profit-driven largely. So is democracy itself under threat? And how is that prevented?
Well, maybe it's kind of naive and I didn't do it very well, but seems to me a distinction between looking at the impact and the potential of AI in an enterprise-like science, right? The attempt through data and evidence to understand and, of course, ultimately control. But let's stick to the understanding bit for a minute, where I think there are hugely wonderful and positive opportunities. But as soon as you stick it into anything socio-economic or political, the very thing you celebrate about its power becomes frightening. So I take refuge in the beauty, truth, and goodness of science.
I think over there.
Can I just follow up immediately on that? So what about public services, education and so on? I mean, you mentioned healthcare, but there's quite a lot of hope, indeed, in around the current government that some of our pretty intractable problems around the quality, efficiency of public services perhaps might be solved or meaningfully addressed by AI. Are you entirely pessimistic of that, dismissive of that?
So let's be careful of hype. A lot of times when people refer to the transformative power of AI in public services, what they really mean is sensible use of data. When the Turing Institute was set up, it was actually the National Institute for Data Science. And I and others resisted like hell it being called the National Institute for AI, which is a tiny bit of the transformation you can do in public services by curating and using data appropriately. The data, potential data and its linkage in the NHS is an absolute goldmine. It's nothing to do with AI.
Thank you. Yes, in the back over there, it's in Jazz. I think the microphone is making its way.
So we've had a generation of people who have grown up already with social media. And I just wonder if there's any evidence that they are less able at critical thinking. Many of us in this room, I think, are teaching that very generation. Maybe we Cambridge students are not representative, but they seem pretty good at critical thinking while also living in this world of social media. And I guess from my perspective, I don't know that it's a lack of critical thinking of the individual as per se the frameworks that are put in place. I work in food and agricultural sector as a scientist, and what I've observed over decades is NGOs publishing reports that defend their position and related NGOs citing those reports and creating this huge complex citation that looks like it's science, but when you dig down, there's no science in there at all. But it all looks legitimate and very scientific. And for even as somebody who's a critical thinker, it's difficult to tease all that apart and say, this is a conspiracy theory and this is not, to actually say what is real truth and what is not truth. Yeah. I'm not too sure it's a problem of the individual's critical thinking as the foundations that exist in society.
Okay. There were two bits to that, is whether your current generation of undergraduates, whether the exposure goes back far enough. I would like to see a forward longitudinal study of 5-year-olds, a really serious study. In relation to crap publications, I think we could do the increasing use of misinformation, etc., the increasing use of large language models, which will spuriously churn something out with references that don't exist. I think we probably could do with some more funded agencies to look at this stuff. You've got things at the moment like Full Fact, BBC Fact Check, but I would have the National Institute for Criticism or something like that.
Thank you. Way back in the end.
A follow-up from that, from undergraduate to postgraduates and early career researchers. I'm a neuroscientist, so I am starting more and more to work with big data that I can't analyze myself like I used to do when I was an undergraduate. And I'm going to need to rely more on deep learning models and things that I don't know I know what I'm putting out of it is being acquired a very, very far from my eye microscope and is going into a kind of AI learning code that I sort of written, but not really. So what worries me is how are we training scientists and are scientists actually understanding the science that we are producing, and can we?
Yeah, there's a recent report we did in the Royal Society, implications of AI for science. A large part of that is we've got to rethink the training of PhDs and postdocs. So this is as necessary a kind of tool as being able to log into Google, as it were. So yeah, there's an implication there.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Right at the start, you said you invited us to think about a comparison with the printing press, and you've touched upon it in various points. But I'm not sure you've answered your own question as to whether AI is more or less significant. I think at the moment people out there have been led to believe it is far, far more significant. I think my own view is that it probably is, but will probably take longer to have that effect. But what I'm interested to know what your actual long-term view is on that.
Well, I'd start with echoing something I said a few minutes ago. What's referred to as AI, we should be a lot more careful about. You know, it's like almost now any kind of program or something, you know. So a better education on what AI actually means. And maybe, what was it, Luther pinned something to the door of a church. I've got these 10 things you should worry about. It's to be pinned up in the corridor of every university department. So always have the checklist in mind of things like explainability, accountability, and something we didn't talk about at all, which is sustainability. It's all very well beating the world Go champion, but if your program is using up half the electricity supply of a small African country to do it, you might eventually wonder, is there a trade-off here that we ought to look at? But I do think more systematic awareness in what this stuff does, what it can do well, what you should worry about, how you should challenge it. I think we're just in the foothills, to be honest.
Thank you.
I hope this is a friendly question, David.
Always. You made to me, slightly surprising statement about the value of the way that the huge amount of data available to the NHS will impact healthcare. And you said that this has got nothing to do with AI. But surely it will do, won't it? Just as, I mean, we've got huge amounts of data that have been used by Demis Savas and John Jumper to develop ways of predicting the 3D structure of proteins without that being reduced to physics and chemistry. So, and in the same way, we'll be able to use all of these data available to the NHS, interpreted using AI-based systems, detecting patterns that will benefit healthcare without necessarily understanding all of the mechanisms that underpin them. So it will be AI, won't it?
Ultimately, yes. But we're still at a stage where in many, many hospitals, patient records are on pieces of paper. They're not electronic records. During the COVID thing at Turing, when at the beginning, when people didn't know what to do, they were just trying loads of things. We were trying to get all the data on everything that anybody was trying, and we could throw a machine learning algorithm spot pattern. We started off talking to about 20 NHS trusts. We ended up with only 2 who had platforms that were compatible for data. So we're starting in the primitive digital world here. So to get to the AI point is a long time away. And you've got a lot more data wrangling, as it were, because there aren't total standards for the collection of clinical data. You've got a whole thing before you get to the algorithmic bit, which is why I think for the next 5 years, the AI stuff is second order to getting the data clean, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The other difference, of course, with the AlphaFold is you're taking amino acid sequences and finding the 3D patterns from them. That's unambiguous amino acid data. I mean, it doesn't have the fuzz of clinical judgment. So it's a lot more difficult, and there's a lot more noise and a lot worse digital base to start from. But yeah, ultimately, of course, yeah.
Thank you.
But I think that the Secretary of State for Health shouldn't go around saying we're going to solve the NHS problem in the next few years with AI. It's not true. Yeah.
Thank you. I will caution the next questioner that they're standing between us and drinks. So if it's, you really think it's important, you should ask the question. Otherwise, we can thank. Yeah, okay, looks like it is an important question.
You have a great responsibility.
You do.
Do I worry about being misquoted? I'd be slightly thrilled to be quoted at all. I'll sue.
Well, I think that's a wonderful way to end. Thank you so much.
All right.